And so that was laid out as an area of work. We didn't have a specific proposal that we were floating on there. It was really identifying a process. And so this is a little different than sometimes things are shown in strategic plans, but the idea was to work closely with community and stakeholders to develop the proposal, and that's what you're going to see the results of that work in just a moment. But we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about that. And so this is really a lot of intentional work that the board has undertaken around how we connect with communities, particularly those communities who have not often had a place at the policy table and have not been well served by our system of education. And so we've done that through a network and partners. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but the idea was to work through intermediaries, those organizations that have connections to many of the communities that haven't been engaged in these conversations in the past, so we could create a more meaningful conversation around that. And then with the task force we developed that represented a broad range of stakeholders, we worked together with them to develop the proposal that you're going to see. And this has been an iterative process between our task force and our board, so an ongoing conversation for about the last 18 months on this. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So before we jump in about what's potentially changing, we thought it would be good to have sort of a foundation of what the current requirements are. So we're going to just briefly touch on these, and then we'll talk about how we structured the work, and then the proposal. So let's go to the next slide. To start with, I mentioned this, the board is responsible for setting and periodically reevaluating the state level high school graduation requirements. And in addition to that, we have some other responsibilities around graduation requirements, like setting scores on assessments, and graduation pathways are a part of the current graduation framework. So doing that, and then some reporting responsibilities. So let's go ahead to the next slide. The current framework for the high school diploma has three key elements. I'm going to talk about each of these in a moment, but just for the purposes of this, students must complete a high school and beyond plan. They must meet the credit and subject area requirements, and they have to complete a graduation pathway option. The three pieces together are intended to signal that a student is ready for post-secondary education, gainful employment, civic engagement, and lifelong learning. Let's go to the next slide and we'll start talking about each of these. So the high school and beyond plan begins by the 7th grade and is intended to guide a student through their thinking about what they want to do when they leave high school, and then but also prepare them with the courses they would need during a high school experience to set them up for success in that post-secondary goal. And so it should be guiding their choices during high school. It should be revisited each year during high school, and then launch them into what they want to do when they move on from our system. So the next piece is the credit and subject area requirements. This is what most people look at when they start thinking of graduation requirements. And this is the 24 credit framework. This has been in place for a while now. This was adopted in 2014, but it wasn't until 2021 that it was fully implemented. And during that time, there have been some adjustments and changes through legislation and other elements over that time. You see there are 17 core courses, 4 electives, and 3 personalized pathway credits. Those personalized pathway credits are intended to create alignment with post-secondary options, and they serve as default courses. And we're going to be talking more about that later, because that becomes a more critical and important part of the framework in the proposal that we're going to be talking about. And let's go to the next slide. And finally, graduation pathway options. Now, this was a more recent change. In 2019, legislation moved us away from the state assessment as a graduation requirement with a set of alternatives to a set of options that students could meet, and it was intended to create some more intentionality and also more options, although most of these choices were available as alternatives if a student did not meet the state assessment requirements. Students have the option to, if they meet the score on state assessment, often they're in a situation where they're not necessarily having to choose these, although technically they should be choosing the pathway that best aligns with their post-secondary option. But there's some variation in how that's implemented over districts. But it includes things like dual credit courses, AP, IB, and Cambridge, either a course or an exam. So if they do a course option on these things, they have to meet a certain grade threshold, usually a B on those. And then there's also grade scores on the exams to meet these different things. And so, or they can do ACT, SAT. So most of these have an exam component, but also there are course options on these. And then students have to meet this in both English and math. And so the ASVAB at the bottom and the career and technical education work a little bit differently. They meet both ELA and math requirements. So those are structured just a little bit differently, but each of these are intended to align with what the student wants to do when they move on to post-secondary education. Let's move on to the next slide. And I think this is where I hand it off to Ariel. So I'm gonna introduce Ariel again.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So again, Ariel Matthews. I am going to give in a little more detail about what this Future Ready initiative is, how we've structured it, who's been involved in the work, and how we've laid it out to really center community voice in these decisions. So this Future Ready initiative is, as Randy mentioned, a collaborative effort with community, and we've really tried to build in intentional inclusion of populations who have historically been kept out of the policymaking space for us. And so we're trying to comprehensively update our graduation requirements so that we're not making multiple small piecemeal changes that can be difficult for students and schools and families to really keep up with and understand. And we're thinking about the skills and knowledge that students are really going to need to thrive in this kind of changing world that they're entering. And so some of that looks like thinking about what does financial education and digital literacy look like for students, and how do we build in more interdisciplinary options and really provide meaningful choice for students as they make decisions about their education. And so this initiative is really culminating into a legislative proposal for the upcoming 2027 legislative session. And at this point, we have decided to really revisit these graduation requirements for a few reasons. One being that students and families are asking for it. They're seeing that within the graduation requirements, there is sometimes not enough support, not enough meaningful choice, not enough courses that students really feel connected to and feel like they're going to have an impact on what their lives look like after they graduate, while also looking like there are a lot of requirements and a lot of spaces that make it difficult for families and students to navigate their education. And so we really want to take the opportunity to streamline that in a way that it is easier for students to move through, while they also will get some more kind of ownership of their education and courses that are really going to prepare them for what their next steps are. Another side of this is kind of the reality of our workforce in this changing world that they're going into. We can anticipate that around 75% of job openings will require post-secondary credentials, and with only about 49% of graduates enrolling in post-secondary education, we really want to think about how we can improve that for students so that they're going into post-secondary options that are going to work for them. For their futures. And then just kind of that other bit that I touched on with students feeling like schoolwork is not necessarily meaningful or connected to what their plans are after graduating. We really want to address that and make this experience something students understand and feel was relevant for them and that they feel connected to. And so this initiative really is about more than just the credits that students are earning. So we have some objectives that this initiative was really set out to address. Part of that is aligning our graduation requirements with our profile of a graduate and really integrating the essential skills and knowledge that students will need while balancing what is core, so what all students will need to take to graduate, while also having some choice for students and having meaningful elective courses and that that students are choosing as a part of their plan for their future. We also want to increase opportunities for interdisciplinary learning and bringing in options that are outside of the traditional classroom and really centering equity and inclusion in that. And then really want to think about how all of this aligns for students from earlier grade levels into what they're doing in their post-secondary education, and taking the time to really think about what implementation will look like for this. We recognize that there will be changes that might take a little more time to implement, especially with the variety of school contexts we have across our state. So we're really taking the time to think critically about what that implementation looks like. What are the impacts on staffing? What does this look like in a building? And how do we communicate this out effectively to parents and families and students? And so to give a little background on the structure of the initiative, we started this, apologies. We started this in January of 2025, or that's when the first task force meeting took place. Of course, planning was happening a little prior to that, but the task force and board spent the first few months going through visioning and level setting so that everyone had a good understanding of what current requirements are, what is happening around our state and across the nation for education, and spent a lot of time hearing from community and other sources about what they want this diploma to represent, what students should really be getting out of their education. So the board and task force created a vision statement during this time, and Alyssa will share a little bit more about that here shortly. The next phase of this work has been the recommendation development phase, where we have been thinking about, okay, now that we know what we want students to be getting out of their education, how do we bring that to life? So what are the specific credits and subject areas that students should be engaging in? Where are the spaces that we can improve flexibility for students? How can we bring in some real meaningful choice so students feel that ownership over their education? And we're now kind of at the end of that, and you're going to see the fruits of all of that work here shortly. And then we will be moving into our legislative proposal phase, where we are developing that proposal that we will be bringing forth for the 2027 legislative session. And just a note on implementation, we are taking the time and consideration to think through implementation concerns for a variety of school contexts, not only as a board and task force, but also through our subcommittees, especially our two implementation focused ones that are thinking through the draft proposals to highlight implications for funding and staffing, scheduling, and other concerns, so that any changes that are rolled out from this process are thoughtful and have the right lead time behind them so that schools can come into these changes with the supports and intentionality that we are planning for. So you've heard me mention a few different groups working on this initiative. So we created a variety of ways to discuss relevant information and hear input through our task force, our community liaisons, and subcommittees. And so I'll give a little bit more detail on each of those groups here in just a second. But we also were able to gather information through our toolkit where community could find important information about the initiative that was updated with some timely questions so that they could host their own listening sessions and provide feedback directly to the board and task force as a way to enter the conversations that were already happening. So for the task force, it was made up of around 30 to 35 folks, really representing a wide range of sectors from students and families, K-12 educators, employers, post-secondary partners, policymakers, and community-based organizations. And we aim to have this group be as reflective of the demographics of our K-12 student population as we could, recognizing that folks coming into this task force would be kind of wearing many hats and really sharing the various intersectionalities of who they are, who they represent, and what spaces they're coming from. So we had a special focus on some particular populations who are most impacted by the policy changes that might occur, as well as thinking about geographic diversity and the range of learning environments that exist across our state. And then on that task force, we also have 6 community liaisons. And these community liaisons are full members of the task force, but they are also compensated for the work that they're doing. So they are attending our task force meetings and engaging in the conversations happening there, but they're also going back to their own communities to provide kind of these easier on-ramps and opportunities for their communities to participate in the conversation. So they have access to resources to kind of help break down some of the participation barriers that may exist. So they're going back into their communities. So it can be things that are near to folks to participate. They're also thinking about transportation concerns, childcare, providing food, having the ability to go and have one-off conversations in some situations. So really these community liaisons who know their communities are finding the ways to best engage with them and bring their voices back into the task force. So we've really appreciated this opportunity to work with these groups across the state. And then we also have our subcommittees that are doing some of that really more specific subject matter work to think through the details of any of these proposals. And we've been working with some partner organizations to do that. So we have our financial education and life skills subcommittee, which is looking at how to include important financial education concepts in the graduation framework, as well as how to address important life skills and experiences students and families are asking for, like how to rent an apartment or manage a household, applying for a job, and protecting income. And that has been led up by the Financial Education Public-Private Partnership. We also had a subcommittee on computer science, technology, and media literacy that Computer Science for All Washington was leading. And they've been looking at how students can stay safe and informed in this digital age and how to ensure students are learning the basic skills needed. And this included exploring AI and the implications of that, and how students can stay safe in these environments. We also had the math subcommittee that the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges has been leading, and they've been looking at what standards and courses students would need to build on and learn core math concepts to prepare them for their futures. And then we have two implementation type subcommittees, one led by the Professional Educator Standards Board, looking at educator development and the student learning experience. And so they were thinking through what teacher training, professional development, and endorsements might look like as we explore interdisciplinary courses and co-teaching and how to create some real community in a school building with mentorship and ensuring that every student is really known and supported in the building. And then we have our implementation subcommittee that is a bit more focused on the nuts and bolts that we at the state board have been leading. And they're thinking through the variety of school contexts across the state, from large urban schools to small rural districts or tribal compact schools and everything in between. So they continue to discuss funding, scheduling, and staffing implications so that there can be timely and smooth implementation for any changes that may result from this process. And so then in this slide deck that y'all will have access to, we do have the list of task force members and subcommittee members. So you'll be able to see kind of the variety of folks who are participating on this, from students and families, community organizations, principals, superintendents, various district staff. Really, we tried to get a good and broad representation and really bring as many voices into this conversation as we could. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Ariel. Again, I'm Alyssa Muller. I'm the State Board Senior Director of Policy. And if you want to go ahead one slide, Ariel. As Ariel mentioned a little bit earlier, at the beginning of this process, we really worked with our Future Ready Task Force and the board to develop a vision statement to think about what does the task force and the board want graduation requirements to do in the future. And then they could use that vision statement once they started developing their policy proposals to hold that up against that vision to say, is this what we said we wanted to do when we set out with this work? So we're not going to read the whole vision statement to you, and it's not perfectly wordsmithed. They really used it as sort of a guiding document for their own work, but in case that was of interest, we did hyperlink it on the slide. So some of the key parts of that vision talk about how graduation requirements need to uphold high expectations that keep multiple post-secondary options open as students' goals evolve. But graduation requirements also need to ensure that all students build a strong foundation of essential knowledge and skills, while also creating space for meaningful student choice, because we hear from students that they really want more agency over their time in high school and their learning experiences. But at the same time, students know that they don't know everything, and they do need guidance from the adults in the system who have more experience and know kind of the pitfalls and the things that students need to keep in mind depending on their plans for post-secondary. So flexibility has to be paired with thoughtful structure and guidance to help students make informed decisions and keep their future options open, so that all students have equitable access to opportunities and aren't unintentionally limited by their early choices. Next slide. So I know we have probably lots of school district folks on this call, maybe some families and community members as well. I'm sure it's no surprise to the school folks on this call that we just wanted to take just a moment to point out how nuancy the laws are around K-12 education. There are requirements that apply to individual students. Those are the graduation requirements. There's requirements that apply to specific high schools, that every high school in the state has to provide access to various programs and learning opportunities to students. Then requirements at the school district level to provide access to certain types of courses or learning opportunities. Then there's also various learning opportunities that the state says is important, and it's up to school districts to offer them or not, but school districts are encouraged to offer them. So as part of this process, we really spent a lot of time with the task force and the board thinking about what's the right policy lever. Are these things that we want to withhold a diploma from a student for not completing, or are these things that we want to make sure every student is guaranteed access to, but every single student doesn't have to complete a certain experience in order to graduate from high school? So that was some of the framing that the task force and the board had as part of this process. Next slide. So we wanted to also just take a moment to talk about the different categories of courses that exist now. And in some ways, would be the same even in the proposed framework, but we wanted to take just a moment to talk through that. So when we talk about core courses, those are the courses that if a student doesn't complete them, they would not earn a diploma. They're the courses that we say every single student without exception needs to complete before they graduate from high school. Then we also have a set of courses called the personalized pathway requirements that Randy talked about a little bit earlier, that these are courses that we would expect most students would take because they keep all post-secondary options open. They align with our minimum college admission standards in the state. But these are also courses that on an individual student basis, in alignment with a student's high school and beyond plan and a clear post-secondary plan that a student has created with the help of their family and their counselors. Then if there's some default courses in the personalized pathway requirements that don't make sense for an individual student, they might be able to substitute those courses. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Then we also have our elective courses because we know in high school is a perfect time for students to explore, be able to dabble in a lot of different subjects, and really find the things that they really want to dig into, whether that's in post-secondary or out in the workforce, to find some time for them to really explore. So that's really the purpose of elective credits. All right, and then before we show you how we are suggesting that graduation requirements change, we also wanted to talk about some things that you won't see in graphics around the credit and subject areas. So one of the things that the board and the task force really got some agreement on early was that from a state level, we want to do some things a little bit differently, just in the sense of we've heard for a long time from students and families and communities that students really want access to more relevant and authentic hands-on learning experiences. And so can we think about ways at the state level to provide better support for ways that could happen through co-teaching models, through interdisciplinary courses, through CTE course equivalency, just finding ways to provide support to districts to be able to offer these really authentic learning experiences to students. So this is going to get a little bit nuancy, but for our K-12 folks on the line that have a little bit of a sense of this, we wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge that right now, CTE course equivalencies allow, if a course is structured to allow a student to meet both core academic learning standards as well as CTE framework standards through an approved framework for the course, students are able to check off two requirements, so both their CTE requirement and the applicable academic course requirement, but they only earn 1 credit. Now that's a little bit different to how the law allows for academic courses that are interdisciplinary, say an interdisciplinary English course and a science course that's taught with both sets of those standards, that if a student is in that interdisciplinary course and they demonstrate proficiency over both the English standards and the science standards, they could take 1 course and earn 2 credits. So we want to make the law a little bit more consistent and allow students who take a CTE course equivalency to, if that individual student meets both sets of learning standards for both the academic course and the CTE framework standards, then they could also earn 2 credits for both the CTE and the academic course. Additionally, you'll see more of this in a moment, but the task force and the board have thought about how do we really want to realign the core and flexible courses to be more responsive to students' needs and their goals through the increased use of personalized pathway requirement courses. So you'll see that on a graphic in just a minute, but I just wanted to mention it here. Additionally, we live in a local control state, and that works really well a lot of the time to really acknowledge sort of that unique local context that we have for districts across the state. However, we also hear from students and families how frustrating it can be when they don't have access to the same credit earning opportunities from district to district in a couple of particular ways. So for instance, some districts in the state have competency-based crediting policies, some don't. Even for the ones that do, those competency-based crediting policies vary pretty widely district to district. Same for when students can be excused from the fitness portion of their PE courses, and same for when multilingual learners can earn language credit for their native language. So we're thinking about ways that we may want to provide some greater consistency through statewide policies for when students can have these credit earning opportunities and be able to provide students across the state a little bit better of equitable access to those credit earning opportunities. Finally, the board and the task force spent quite a bit of time talking about the graduation pathway requirement. And we've heard for quite a while from students and families a couple of things. One, families often think about graduation requirements as just the courses that students have to take. And so it's confusing for a lot of families to find out that in addition to the courses, students also have this extra requirement, that graduation pathway requirement Randy talked about earlier, where students are either having to pass the state standardized assessment or other standardized assessments like the SAT and ACT or the ASVAB test for the military, or some dual credit courses, things like that. And so sort of the consensus among most task force members and board members was that rather than having this requirement, which we have heard for years from students and families, that is not meaningful to individual students and does not actually help them prepare for their post-secondary plans, that we want to take that requirement away and instead allow that time to be spent on really intentional course planning and having counselors and students really work together to think about how are the courses and various activities that they're engaging in through high school individually preparing students for their very specific post-secondary plans. So that will be a recommendation coming out of this work as well, to remove the graduation pathway requirement. One other thing I wanted to mention before we move into the suggested changes to credit and subject area requirements is around financial aid as a graduation requirement. Folks may know that the governor has set this as a priority to have completion of students' financial aid submitted to either the federal government or the state government through FAFSA or WASFA be a graduation requirement. We think that the best way to achieve this is through a student's high school and beyond plan, in the sense that already students have to receive information about financial aid programs through their high school and beyond plan. And so we think we could go a step further and define evidence as having students as part of their high school and beyond plan, perhaps as a class activity, walk through the sample paper form. So that students are really getting exposure to the process, they're understanding potentially how to fill out those financial aid forms, and so the forms themselves become a little bit less scary, and then students would be better prepared to do that with their families if they so chose. All right, so I want to get into the meat of the proposal. You're going to have to bear with me because there's definitely some changes I want to talk through on this slide. So we're going to be on this slide for a little bit. So from the current framework, there are no recommended changes to the English requirements, and there's no recommended changes to the science requirements. However, for the math requirements, there are a change. So there's no changes to the first 2 credits for math. Those remain either Algebra 1 or Integrated Math 1, and then Geometry or Integrated Math 2 for those first 2 credits. But for the 3rd credit, the math subcommittee recommended narrowing that credit a little bit. So right now, the 3rd credit of math is wide open for students to take any course that aligns with their high school and beyond plan. And so the math subcommittee recommended narrowing that down to either Algebra 2 or Integrated Math 3 or statistics or financial algebra or that other course you see listed on the screen. So narrowing that down to 4 courses. And then the task force recommended taking it one step further so that if a student is not sure what they want to do after high school, that to keep all doors open to students, that the recommended default course for students would be Algebra 2 or Integrated Math 3, so that students are meeting those minimum college admission standards for the public universities in our state that align pretty well nationally with college admission standards. So if a student is absolutely certain they don't want to go straight to university and they and their families decide that they would rather take a different class other than Algebra 2 or Integrated Math 3, that's great. They have those 3 other options. But if a student doesn't know, then the recommendation would be for them to take that default course that keeps all options open. Additionally, related to math, moving into the personalized pathway requirements for just a moment, one of the other minimum college admission standards is that students engage in a senior year quantitative reasoning course, which is either a math class beyond Algebra 2 or Integrated Math 3, or an algebra-based science course. There's a variety of different options that could meet that from an admission standpoint. But that doesn't live in our current framework right now. And so to, again, have better alignment with college admission standards, adding that senior year quantitative reasoning course as a recommended default for students to take as one of their personalized pathway requirements. So students wouldn't be required to take that, but it would be strongly recommended for all students to consider that to keep all doors open to them after high school.
And I want to jump in too, just because there was a question about it a few minutes ago in the chat, and just to say that the personalized pathway, this default set of pathways, is designed to align with our college admission standards for public four-year colleges. It's also designed to keep really all doors open to post-secondary education training work. So that's why you see CTE still addressed in there, and you see some other things that aren't really part of the four-year college's priorities, but are part of what prepares a student to be ready for post-high school life.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, I'll keep moving across this slide now. So back on social studies, there is a change within the social studies requirements. Currently, there's a half credit standalone of civics and a half credit of contemporary world problems. The task force really spent some time just talking about how sort of in the state of the world we live in right now, to ensure that our students are ready to meaningfully participate in a democracy, they need more time with civics in high school. And so there's a recommendation that become a 1.0 credit of civics, and then have that contemporary world problems built into that content so that it's taught through a civics lens. So a little bit of a change with that social studies requirement there. Additionally, right now within the core requirements, there's 1.5 credits of physical education and a half credit of health. We, after the task force and the board both had time to engage, the recommendation that we're at right now is that there would be a half credit of health within the core and a half credit of physical education in the core. And then within the PPR, there is an additional half credit of health and a half credit of PE. So we would expect most students would end up taking a full credit of health and a full credit of PE, but there is a little bit of flexibility there for those PPR courses. We really heard from students and communities that students are wanting more mental health content. And so that's why there's that increase in health credits from the current framework. And, you know, students could make a different choice if they decide they don't want that additional half credit of health within the PPRs. Moving into art, right now we have 1 art credit in core, and then we have an additional art credit within the PPRs. So within this framework, we still have that 1 art credit in the core, but there's not a second art credit within the PPRs. We did, kind of to Randy's point, have a lot of conversations about what are the right classes to have in that framework. And so, we still have the 2 world language credits that are in the PPRs now, as well as in this proposed new framework. Those haven't changed. We have a new class around financial education, life skills, and the high school and beyond plan. That's the only real new class in the framework, because we've heard from for years, really from just about every stakeholder group, that students really need to have time in high school to learn financial literacy skills, as well as life skills. And so between the task force and the board, there's this recommendation about a 1.0 credit where you could do some of the high school and beyond plan content, financial education, and life skills within that course. However, recognizing that some school districts already have like a half credit standalone for financial education, and they have a different course for the high school and beyond plan, wanting to leave a little bit of local flexibility there for school districts to be able to deliver that content through a couple of different classes if that worked better for their local context. Additionally, as Randy mentioned, there is the career and technical education course that in the current framework is in the core, is now in the personalized pathway requirement section of the framework. Because we heard from a lot of our community engagement that on the one hand, career and technical education courses are so important for students. They're a really good example of where students are having those real world relevant learning experiences, especially if their school can offer a wide variety of CTE courses. But on the other hand, for students that are in really small or rural schools, if they are in a school that only offers, for instance, an agriculture CTE course and they are not remotely interested in agriculture, that we don't want to require a student take a CTE course that they're not interested in if they could take a course that better aligns with their post-secondary plans and their high school and beyond plan goals. So again, we would expect that the vast majority of students in our state should still be taking a CTE course because it's a strongly recommended default. But on the other hand, in specific circumstances where it doesn't make sense for an individual student to take that CTE course, it's in the PPR section so that students have a little bit of flexibility there. You'll also note that in this framework, you see on this slide that there are 3 elective credits. Just hold that in your brains for just a second, because I want to talk about that on the next slide in just a second. But I also just wanted to go ahead and point out here that, again, just to reinforce from that definition slide, not only would we expect that most students would take most of the classes listed as defaults in the personalized pathway requirements, we want to require every school to offer all of these courses so that students have appropriate access to them. All right, we are playing around a little bit with how to better show the high school graduation requirements. So in some ways, this is a nice test run for us to be able to show this new draft graphic to y'all. One of the things that the board talked a bit about, as well as the task force in some of their prior meetings, was around how the career and technical education requirement is sort of a unusual requirement in some ways, or that it's different in some ways than some of the other core courses, in the sense that a student could take a career and technical education course that, if a school has a CTE course equivalency, it may end up counting for one of their core credits. It may end up being one of their personalized pathway requirements, or it may end up being one of their electives. Because there's such a wide variety of CTE program areas and courses, it's sort of an unusual requirement in some ways. And so we thought about displaying it this way, where CTE is listed as an additional requirement, sort of like Washington State history, where it's something that students would be expected to do before graduating. But on the other hand, it's not a separate standalone credit out of their 24 credits. One of their 24 credits likely would be a CTE course, but it's not a standalone credit. So if you kind of hold that in your brain, I know it's super nuancy, then there's still those 4 elective credits that there are in the current framework. So that's one way we've thought about displaying the graduation requirements just a little bit differently. Alrighty, so we did want to provide just a couple of different examples of how this new proposed framework could work for different students with different areas of interest. So we have one example for a student who their goal in their high school and beyond plan is that they want to become a nurse. And so they are taking some CTE courses that count as their science class as well. It's a nursing assistant course. So they're taking courses within the CTE health science program area, but also they know that to become a nurse, they're going to eventually need a university degree. And so they're also meeting all of their minimum college admissions standards. So like they're taking their global language credits, and then they're also kind of dabbling in other areas of interest. So they're taking a psychology class. They're also maybe doing an internship at the high school. So just wanting to show how this proposed framework with more courses in the personalized pathway requirement does allow a student to really specialize a little bit more and kind of dig in their areas of interest. All right, we also wanted to show an example of a student who's really interested in the arts. And so, even though in this framework, we don't have a second arts credit in the PPRs, again, adding those additional credits to the personalized pathway requirement section of the framework allows a student to really dig in on the arts. So they're taking their one arts core credit. They're also taking 3 different credits of arts courses within their PPRs, as well as another art credit as part of their electives. So just showing a little bit more flexibility there. Finally, one of the things that both the task force and the board spent a bit of time talking about is how under the current framework, a critique we hear a lot about the current 24 credit framework is that particularly for schools that have a 6-period day with 24 credits, there's, quote, no room to fail. Additionally, there's not a ton of space for students to explore their areas of interest. That gets compounded when you have students who need to take a bunch of support classes, like students with disabilities or multilingual learners. And so wanting to show here how this framework could potentially benefit a student with disability to still have some courses that they get to take that are areas of interest for them versus all of their core classes and their PPRs being dictated and then all of their electives being support classes. In this framework, they get a little bit more space to explore through that expansion of the PPR credits. All right, and then we did hyperlink to our website and various other resources, since you'll get a copy of this slide deck in case that was helpful for you if you wanted to look back at some of these things. And then, of course, you also have our contact information if you want to reach out after the webinar. But I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brandy and Ariel. I'll catch up on the Q&A a little bit, and we'll start moving into our live Q&A portion.
And so this first one, are you strictly credits in high school and beyond plan and eliminating pathways completely? And so the answer to that is the proposal would be to eliminate the graduation pathways as a graduation requirement. The only nuance I would say to that is that much of what's in there is part of the accountability framework. So it would still be an important part of our system accountability to ensure that students are doing well on the state assessments, as well as, for example, our accountability framework includes dual credit course taking. And so some of those other things would still be captured in there. There's interest in still maintaining some work around CTE as well to make sure students are having access to those kinds of courses. So, and as Alyssa mentioned, that includes actually opening up CTE a little bit more so that students can earn credit and have it recognized in each of the areas in which it applies. All right. So, and then art doesn't include visual media and performing arts. The answer is yes. Right now it's the arts generally. So your music class could count towards the art credit currently, and that would continue in that same way, as well as visual art or other performing art. Alyssa and Ariel, feel free to jump in on some of these too if you like. I'm going to actually ask Alyssa to take this one on. So how are you protecting youth when implementing the 2-for-1? And Alyssa, you did a good job of describing how this works. And we're currently doing this in the academic environment. So do you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, it's been sort of interesting because as I mentioned, it's already allowable under law for students who take in interdisciplinary academic courses to earn 2 credits through that one course if on an individual basis they have demonstrated proficiency over both sets of those standards. So we actually looked at the data because we were sort of curious about that as well recently, and across the state looking to see what percentage of students graduate early, and it's really small, like I think 1 to 2%. So it's already allowable. And I think what we see is that students, generally speaking, often then spend that time taking other courses of interest to them. Or if students are, struggling in some subjects but excelling in others, right, then that allows them to catch up. We hear a lot under the current 24 credit framework. There's, quote, no room for failure within a 6-period day. And so I think that's another way that some schools are having students be able to catch up by taking courses and really excelling in some areas while they're, having some other growth areas. So hopefully that helps, Gretchen, and let us know if we didn't answer your question.
Yeah, and so I'll take the next couple. So on the health requirement, the current requirement is actually half a credit in health. And so there's not a change in the core on the health requirement. But the point in this question about additional topics being added, that was part of what motivated the board to want to add additional health, because not only has there been additional content already added to the half credit that's required in the framework since that was initially adopted, but in addition to that, we heard a lot from students about certain things they wanted to see in a health curriculum around mental health in particular. And so that's why you see the other half a credit that's been added as a PPR credit there. And because a lot of that came from students, we think students will select that content because it's something they're asking for. Is there more you would add to that one, Alyssa?
I think that's good for now. But again, okay. Christina, if you had additional follow-ups, let us know.
Yeah, and I saw your box turn blue, so I thought I wanted to talk, but all right. And then world language actually has not changed. So in the proposed framework, it's the same as it currently is in terms of being a personalized pathway credit for 2 credits. There is a proposal, and Alyssa could maybe talk more about this, around how we recognize world language for English language learners. And so do you want to talk more about, or multilingual learners, I should say. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that one, Alyssa?
Sure. Yeah, this is really an area of further work for the board and others. But there have been a couple of states that are thinking about, rather than having an English language arts requirement, having a language arts requirement. Now that would take a number of years of work to really look at the English language arts standards and the standard for multilingual learners and figure out which standards could be demonstrated in a student's native language versus need to be demonstrated in English. So that's kind of a few years out. But one of the things that we think could be done sooner potentially is for multilingual learners that are in districts that for whatever reason don't provide them access to tests like the STAMP test that allow a native speaker to be able to pass a proficiency test for their native language and not have to take those credits. If a multilingual learner is in a district where they don't have access to those tests, but they're able to pass their English language arts course at grade level, so they're pretty far along in their English proficiency, then could we, through competency-based crediting, then transcribe world language credits on a student's transcript to recognize their native language? So really an area of further work in trying to recognize the asset that it is to have a student who is a multilingual learner with multiple languages. When I'll speak for myself, I speak one language. So I think that's pretty incredible.
I'm going to ask Ariel to answer these next two because she's been doing the educator development piece. So we're working with that task force. And so there's a question around certification for financial ed and life skills. And then we have a question on what students find meaningful as well that I think you're best suited to respond to.
Yes. For the what students find meaningful. So we've been doing a variety of engagement sessions with different tribes and students from those tribes, as well as going into some different schools. So our community engagement coordinator and tribal liaison, Anna, has been heading up that. We've also been collecting that information. So as they've been holding listening sessions and gathering feedback from their communities and students and families, they've been providing that back to us through our toolkit. And so we've been sharing in our Google Drive for Future Ready kind of what has been coming out of those engagements. So it's been a variety of listening sessions, having opportunities to go into classrooms and having conversations with students. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our community liaisons who have been doing similar work within their own communities. And so we have been gathering the conversations that have been coming from that, and that information is available in our Future Ready Google Drive.
And just a couple examples too, just like, so financial education actually and life skills is one of the top things we're hearing from folks. So it's kind of the one of the things, but we also heard a lot about how things are taught as part of that. They want to have more active learning opportunities and that sort of thing. So it's less about subject area in many cases and more about how students are able to engage with the content. Yeah. And then the financial ed and life skills. So that's been a certificate. First of all, financial education is already required to be delivered across our districts, but there's not a specific certification for that. And it is something we've been talking to educators about what the preparation for this could look like. But I don't think we have a firm answer on that. And that's where Ariel, because you've been more close to that group, is there more you would share on that one?
I can jump in as well, Randy.
Oh.
And I think, yeah, that subcommittee has really thought about what makes sense for endorsements there. And so I think there will be a recommendation in our report around that. Also acknowledging, like Randy said, there are a lot of districts providing these courses already, and there's not a specific endorsement for it. So certainly an area of future work, and we'll make a forthcoming recommendation around that.
All right, I think we have a couple more. Oh, lots coming. Oh, lots of questions coming in. Thank you. All right, let me move these over. The Q&A thing works a little different than I'm used to in this tool, so I apologize. So additional health credit is very important. So I think that's a comment, not a question. I'll just take that one over. And then how will you guarantee what is being taught in health education? We know currently that students are getting credit through CTE classes and are not meeting all the health standards. So I just say to that a couple things. One is that, yeah, a lot of districts are delivering their health curriculum through CTE. I can't really speak to the other piece of this. It is a local determination about how students or how courses meet the various standards, and students are required to meet the standards in order to meet the requirement. And so if there are specific concerns around that, that would be something to work with the districts on. But those standards are something that each district is supposed to be. In order to earn credit, students need to be demonstrating that they're meeting the standards in that course. And so with CTE, actually, there's a lot of requirement in terms of how they align courses to the standards as well. So I'll mention that as well. So CTE has actually more controls than some of the other courses in that regard. Looking at my colleagues, anything else you would add on that?
I mean, I might just add, even though, of course, the State Board of Education Authority is over graduation requirements, of course, we are really excited to see what the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction is doing as they work to update the health and physical education standards. And I know that SHAPE Washington, I apologize in advance if I screw up this acronym, but it's the Society of Health and Physical Education Teachers. I know they've worked really closely with OSPI, and so I'm really excited to see those updated learning standards that I hope will start to address that concern as well. But certainly an area of, I think, further work for our state.
Alyssa, can I ask you to answer the world language one I just published?
Maybe, except I don't see it yet, Randy. Sorry, y'all.
Okay.
We're learning teams.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, there we go. Why would a district not have access to world language tests? Not all districts provide students access to those tests. I think, again, particularly our small and rural districts, we've certainly heard from families of students that are frustrated that they can't have their native language recognized because their district don't provide students access to those tests. So in an ideal world, every district would provide students access to those proficiency tests as appropriate for their native language.
All right. And then, so there's a question about should a student get credit if they get a score of 4 on the SBE in either math or ELA? Some districts have that policy, and we haven't gotten into that level of detail in terms of whether or not that would be part of a statewide policy, but Alyssa mentioned that we're considering looking at a sort of statewide minimum policy for competency credits. Is there any more you would add on that one, Alyssa?
I might just add that while, of course, we don't ever want to get ahead of our board, so we don't want to make promises, one of the things I see the most in district policies across the state, if they have them, is providing students credit for a proficient score on SBAC. So I think there would be a good chance that that's something that we may want to include in a statewide policy.
And then a question about whether digital money management would be in the future standards. And so actually OSPI has published draft standards for financial education. And so I'd encourage folks to look at that. I do not recall whether that is explicitly called out on there. And do others know, Alyssa, Ariel?
I believe it is a little bit. Of course, I don't know every standard and every subject, but I think it touches on it at least. And if folks saw the prior version of the standards, there wasn't a whole lot of change between the prior version and what they ended up publishing. So if you're aware, just based on how you've reviewed in the past, that might be helpful context.
All right. Putting a couple more in the published column here. Is there a CTE framework for financial education? That's another one I cannot answer. We may have to look that one up.
Okay. Yeah, there is a lot of the financial education courses taught in our state are taught through a CTE course.
Yeah, and then how can students graduate early if they need a 4th year of English? A couple ways that can happen. And so one is Running Start students can often complete their 4th year of English quicker because of the way that works. And also in competency programs, they could potentially finish quicker on that. I would say with that, we're not trying to encourage anybody to graduate earlier, but it is potentially possible. So Alyssa, anything you'd add to that one?
I think that covers it, Randy.
Yeah. And let's see. Okay, another certification question. I'm going to give you a sec to think about that one while I pop another one in. These are a little bit longer, so give us just a moment. So interdisciplinary courses, I'll start on that one. And it's another one Alyssa may want to finish up. There are a couple ways that can be delivered now. In many cases, it involves team teaching, but it can also be done with teachers who are endorsed in multiple areas. There's not an interdisciplinary endorsement per se at this point in time, although that's a longer conversation that we would want to have with PESB. And Alyssa, would you add more to that one?
Oh, I have so many things I want to add to that one, but I'm going to try to be short. Also, Miranda, you know how to get a hold of me, so feel free to reach out and we can chat more. But I would say a couple of things. I do think right now the best way, sort of best practice for interdisciplinary courses that we see is when teachers team teach. So like an English teacher is team teaching with a science teacher, right? So you have those appropriate endorsements for both. However, working with our educator development and student learning experience subcommittee, I do think there is an interest from that subcommittee in thinking about, are there ways that we would want to better prepare educators coming out of educator preparation programs to teach interdisciplinary courses? Do we want to think about different types of endorsements or specialty endorsements, or different kinds of various options for delivering additional professional development to teachers to prepare them to teach in that way? So yeah, I do think that's something that we may end up recommending as part of this process, and then it would be up to, of course, the Professional Educator Standards Board to take that up. So lots of thoughts.
Yeah, and so I'll take that. So there's a question here about greater emphasis and pathways specifically around requirement for world language. And again, world language is currently a PPR requirement. We would keep it in that space. And we do know it's important for college admission. We also think it's an important life skill that students should be taking world language. And so one of the things that this framework does, because it creates more flexibility by reducing the number of core, it actually allows those students that really want to dig in on world language to take more credits there without conflicting with other courses that they may want to take in the same way as it can now, depending on a student's overall schedule. Sometimes students are being asked to make choices between, say, their world language class and their music class or something like that. And so the hope would be that this creates a little more breathing room in a sense to allow for that. But it isn't changing the current requirement. What we are doing, though, is we're strengthening the language around PPRs just to kind of raise that expectation. These are really the courses we expect students to be taking, unless they have a really intentional plan that varies from this. And so we think it's going to, in the final framework, be stronger language than we currently have around that pathway, those pathway credits, I should say. And then in terms of reducing credits, right now students can get a waiver for 2 credits of the 24 credits. And that's one of the policies we're looking at, creating more consistency across the state. And so that may be the way to address that. And what that looks like in the final framework, we're not 100% certain yet, whether we change the framing of what that 2 credit waiver looks like. I didn't ask, so anything to add to either of those, Alyssa or Ariel? All right, how are we doing on questions? We have another batch. All right. All right, next one is a comment encouraged by how double credit earning and other flexibilities make room for students to earn more dual credit before graduation. I'll pop that one in there. Would you please share community's view on art education? So I'm going to share. So The draft framework we had prior to the board meeting had art as a PPR credit. After listening to feedback and discussion with the board, we moved that back into core. So there is a 1 credit core requirement in art in this version of the framework. And then the other thing I would say about that is that we in the current graduation requirements, there is an additional art requirement in the personalized pathway credits. That is not included in here. We opted instead to keep it open as a general elective. And that is because the purpose of those in the current framework was really to align with university admission requirements, and our universities don't currently require 2 credits for admission. So that's part of what's behind that. But part of it is also that desire to create more flexibility for students to design a path that meets their post-secondary needs. I'm going to keep going, and sorry, I'll just jump in if there's more to say as I pause on these. But there's a question about whether programming language could meet world language. I would say we didn't talk about that as a world language, although there was a bill that would have done that a few years ago in the legislature. But a student who wanted to dig in on programming instead of world language, that would just be something they would document as part of their high school and beyond plan in consultation with their school and their parents, and they could substitute the world language with programming language in that way. That said, university likely would not accept it from an admission standpoint, but I can't speak for the universities. So, all right. Question about the PPRs and okay, I'm going to go back to a couple of these. All right. So the personalized pathway requirements are what we're intending to convey here. And there was a question earlier that I answered online that we didn't talk about out loud, but related to that as well. And so the idea of the PPRs in this framework is really a set of default courses. So if a student doesn't make an intentional choice, they would be expected to complete those courses. However, in consultation with parents and educators, students may have a different path or a choice that better fits their post-secondary goals. And so they could do that, and that would be documented as part of the high school and beyond plan. So any of those PPR courses could be substituted with another course that better meets the students' post-secondary goals. But the default choice, the expected choice for most students, unless they are making that intentional choice, would be to complete the courses shown in the PPRs. So that's the intent there. It's actually the intent in the current framework too, but it wasn't drafted as clearly as that, I don't think. And so we're trying to really be more clear about that. And the comment I mentioned or referenced earlier is we are looking at the language around that as well. And so it's possible that language may shift in the final framework. So we're trying to really figure out what conveys the nature of those courses in the best way. And then clarify graduation requirements just back to credits in high school and beyond plan. If no pathways, no tests, I'm not seeing detail regarding this. So what would be coming off would be the graduation pathway requirements. So that's the state test or those other alternatives that are listed there, AP, IP exams, ASVAB exam. Those are currently graduation requirements. They are also tests that many students take for other reasons. The state test would still be a requirement for state accountability. Students would still be asked to sit for the test in 10th grade, and that score would still be used as part of the school's accountability scoring. But it would not be a high school graduation requirement, which incidentally is how most states implement their state tests. Most states do not include it as a graduation requirement. And so this would be kind of coming into alignment with that general purpose as an accountability tool, not a graduation requirement. So that's, and so then, but yes, students would still need to be credits, and they would still need to complete the high school and beyond plan. And I would argue that the high school and beyond plan becomes more critical, particularly for those students who are varying from that default pathway, because it's the way we document and represent that the student has a different goal and why they're substituting courses. All right. I'll move a comment over here as well. And let's see. So comment regarding art and art standards and the 2 credit requirement. Disappointed to see art, the changes to art. So yeah, we a lot of discussion about how we at the same time balance a well-rounded education with the need for flexibility to adapt to individual student needs. And so this is a challenging area for us. By no means is it an indication that we don't value art, and I think that's important. There is some additional legislation related to art as well that requires it be offered each year, both in terms of performing arts and visual arts. So there are some requirements on schools to ensure that this is maintained as an offering for students. And then why reduce the PE? So that really was coming largely from the task force and from our listening with students, the change to include more health. In terms of how that gets integrated, really what's important is that health standards are being addressed. And so there are different ways that could be implemented in a particular school. And that kind of gets back at what Alyssa was talking about around how you can meet multiple requirements in a course, as long as you're meeting the learning standards for those multiple requirements. So different schools could implement this in different ways. But the idea there is to really emphasize the opportunity for students to access more health curriculum. And I'm going to turn to my colleagues and see if I skipped anything I should have mentioned on either of those. I'll catch up on the new ones coming in. So just a note that the high school beyond plan may require more individualized guidance and counselor time. How are we thinking about capacity? And this is a large part of what's behind the course that Alyssa talked about around that financial education and life skills and high school and beyond plan. Those are all lumped together because there's a strong relationship between each of those areas. But the high school and beyond plan of that part of that is to create an opportunity for dedicated time during the school day for students to interact with their high school and beyond plan and do some of that work. So that's in large part how that gets addressed. But we do recognize that this is a different use of counselor time as well. And that's part of what is behind removing the graduation pathway option as well, is to free up some counselor time to be rededicated to intentional planning. And I think Alyssa talked a little bit about that as well. But that in itself probably is not enough to create the environment. So that's why we think it's important to have that time during the school day for students to interact with their plan as well. And then, all right, and then if students complete their IB diploma or have all the credits, should they graduate after 3 years when they meet requirements? These are, students can do that currently, although I think IB is hard to complete in 3 years, but others could correct me on that. But students can do that. It's pretty rare that that's happening for students. The sort of easiest, in quotes, time to do that is actually with Running Start, because students can accumulate so many credits quickly in that program. In fact, we had a student board member who did exactly that a year ago. So, and so it is possible in that circumstance. but then the other side of the question, can they stay for a fourth year? Well, again, if they met all the requirements, I think that may be a local decision about how students can stay. And I'm not sure about the fifth. We didn't really talk about the fifth year idea here. I'm looking at my colleagues to see if that came up in.
Districts would graduate them, with the exception of students with disabilities that have an IEP transition plan that allow them to stay through the year that they turn 22.
Thank you, Melissa. All right. Let's see, I just moved something over, which I think is a comment, but I didn't click on the read more part. Okay, so appreciation for the flexibility in PE and health. And then there's a question about applied math. I think the financial algebra is an applied math option. And then of course, as Alyssa mentioned, any of the courses could have a CTE course equivalency as well. So there's an opportunity for that. That would, there are several that for math requirements. Is there more you would say on that one, Alyssa?
I think the other thing I would say is that in sort of informal conversations with OSPI, so not speaking on their behalf, but certainly they are aware of these recommendations, and I think are very interested in continuing to have CTE course equivalencies that would be sort of, as the name implies, equivalent to these new math requirements. So I think there may be some interest in developing new CTE course equivalencies as this proposal moves forward.
And then where should the time be placed? I think this is referring to the High School Beyond Plan financial ed course. And so one of the things on that is, at least in our current conception of this, is we're not dictating exactly how that gets implemented in terms of whether a district may want to split that in a particular way or use advisory time. It could be delivered in a lot of ways, and there are a lot of districts already doing a course like this. But it's also one of the reasons we think a model curriculum is important for this class, is to at least provide some guidance for districts in terms of how it could be delivered. We have seen some of this feedback around CBAs, and that's one of the questions we're talking to our educator development subcommittee around, is just like, how do we ensure that we have the teachers that are prepared to provide this education and how it fits in the overall framework. Alyssa, did I miss anything on that one? Or get anything wrong?
I think you hit the high points. Yeah, it's certainly an area of ongoing work for, I think, to more fully develop those recommendations, but critical point that Randy made around having that state model curriculum to help. I might also just mention, we are really excited about the universal platform school links and some of the extra capacity that might provide, so that educators don't feel like they have to know everything about every requirement. And some of that is built in at a district level through the platform to help students be able to see how to meet different requirements as they're working on their high school and beyond plan and doing that course plan in collaboration with their counselors.
There are quite a few questions about the Civics and Contemporary World Problems course. And so if we could give a bit more detail about what is the content included in that course, what was the thinking behind the decision of combining those two, particularly when the civics requirement started as embedded content in contemporary world problems, and some schools moved away from that. So if you could talk a little bit about that decision and what the balance of contemporary world problems to civics might be.
You want to start, Randy?
I was just going to say, this is sort of a continued evolution on that. I think the standalone civics was designed to protect and make sure we're offering civics, and this is taking a little bit further to say we really think the whole credit ought to be focused on civics, and that contemporary world problems can be an embedded element on that. So it's really continuing that progression to a more meaningful and intensive civics education. What would you add to that?
No, I think that's a good summary along with what I said earlier. But if folks continue to have additional questions, of course, feel free to continue to put those into chat. I don't think we had an example with the CTE specific one. I'm seeing this question around construction trades. I just want to touch on that and say, actually, this would allow a student to have that more focus more on CTE as well, so they could replace some of the PPL credits with additional CTE credits or load their electives in that way. So certainly that would create space for that. And then in addition to that, I would note that that change in the 2-for-1 policy that Alyssa talked about is really important in some of these programs, because many of them take a lot of hours, but students aren't necessarily getting a credit that's consistent with the number of hours they're putting in for those classes.
Let's see, we also have a few questions thinking about the kind of additional counseling time that these new requirements may take, so that students are taking courses that are important for whichever pathway they may go down. So if we could talk a little bit about what the kind of thought process is around how to address those additional counseling needs, particularly for smaller districts that might have a harder time getting the correct folks in the building.
Yeah, I'll start, and Alyssa may want to chime in on this one too. But just to say, and hopefully you can hear me better now than earlier. So at any rate, to say that there are a couple elements to that. So one is by removing the high school graduation pathways, that does free up some counselor time that's currently spent in essentially a triage process where if a student hasn't met their high school graduation assessment score, then they may be directed into different things. And so that's an intensive advising process in many places as they're working with students that need to navigate that. And then in addition to that, though, that's part of what's behind the idea of that additional course going financial ed, life skills, and high school beyond plan to help create an opportunity during the day for students to interact with the high school beyond plan and to really have that intentionality that's intended, is always intended in that plan, but isn't always happening in every district.
Yeah, I think in addition to everything Randy said, I would also add that we know that the state, some of the districts are still in the process of moving over to the new universal platform for high school and beyond plan, School Links. And so we know that School Links will help a little bit with this in the sense of districts are able to put in sort of the state framework. And so those recommended default courses for the personalized pathway requirements, students would be able to see that in advance of meeting with their counselors so they could get a sense of what's recommended for all students. And then counselors would be able to have those conversations with students about, and if you want to take a course different from the recommended default, here are those potential implications. So yeah, certainly don't want to minimize counselor time on this. Counselors are already having to have those conversations for the existing 3 PPR credits. But yeah, don't want to minimize that. I think the other thing I would say is that we may not have said as clearly as perhaps we should have earlier in the webinar is that graduation requirement changes that are found by OSPI to have a fiscal impact would not take effect until they're funded by the legislature. So we also have that as a process moving forward with these recommendations.
All right, looks like we have another question in here with many upvotes. So 67% of students say their coursework is not meaningful, struggling to understand how their education applies to their future. So you're taking out a requirement to take courses that directly apply to their future via CTE and offer dual credit industry certifications and practical applications students are looking for. Can you address that?
I'll start again, and Alyssa sort of touched on this, but we do think relevance and engagement for students is super important in this. Students do that in many ways in different types of courses, and CTE is a great example for a lot of students and how they can meet those requirements. It's not always the right fit for every student. So in some cases, it's because of limited offerings in a particular area that don't necessarily meet the individual students' needs. Or it may be that just a different course that may also be hands-on. If I'm going to be a music major, I may get more out of taking additional music courses than if taking a CTE course. So it is really intended to be student-specific. However, I'd also just say that we really want to emphasize the default is that most students we expect to be taking this default series of courses. And so it's not necessarily every student's going to substitute, but by and large, we'd expect them to continue to take the defaults, which is kind of what happens now with most students as well.
All right, and can you please provide more of an explanation about what the senior year quantitative course is and the PPR box? Might have missed that explanation.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, the senior year quantitative reasoning course is one of the college academic distribution requirements, those minimum college admissions standards in our state. And so there's a variety of different courses that could meet that. The other courses that are listed for the third credit of math in the graphic could meet that senior year quantitative reasoning course. So could bridge to college math, so could algebra-based science courses like physics and chemistry, so could math courses beyond Algebra 2 or Integrated Math 3. So there's a lot of different courses that could work for that. We just know that research shows that students really need to stay engaged in math in their senior year to then go into math in college. And so I think that's why historically our universities have wanted that senior year quantitative reasoning course for that recency for students around math.
Right, and I have a question here for arts asking, is there a specific reason that media arts are not included in the arts? Currently it's showing visual and performing.
I would have to brush up on my caters unless Randy knows, but I would imagine that we intend for the arts to be fairly broad as long as they align with the arts requirements that our universities have. Randy, would you say anything else on that?
No, and I think most likely that would probably count in that space, but that is one we'd have to, it's a good question to take another look at to make sure that that's included.
All right, and can you re-clarify the framing of the non-credit requirements you mentioned, like Washington State history or CTE?
Yeah, so typically Washington State history, most of the time in our state is taught in middle school. And so we don't consider that to be like a separate credit requirement that students have to have on their high school transcript. It's just that they have to have met that in middle school. And if not, then they could take it in high school as a credit requirement. So similarly for CTE, we were just trying to acknowledge sort of the nuance of the fact that a CTE course could, if there's a CTE course equivalency, it may be a student's math course, for instance, that's a CTE course. It might be a course that a student takes for one of their PPRs or their electives. So mostly just wanted to point out that students don't have to have like a separate box for CTE on their transcript. It doesn't have to be like a standalone CTE course that's 1 credit. It could be one of their other courses that they're taking. But again, with the thinking that CTE would be a personalized pathway requirement, we would strongly recommend and expect the vast majority of students to take a CTE class, but it wouldn't be required for every student to graduate.
And could you give some more detail or reiterate around the smarter balanced assessment requirement? So with removal of pathways, how will the state get meaningful standardized data about student achievement?
Yeah, I'd start by saying most states actually don't include their state assessment as part of high school graduation requirements, and students would still be required to take that in the 10th grade, and it would still be part of the school accountability structure. So we're not proposing any changes in that way. The only change is to say it doesn't necessarily make sense to include that as a graduation requirement. And already students who have the option to take something else, or they sit for the exam, but they can also, if they know they're going to do ASVAB, that's really where they're supposed to be focusing. So, and so I would say that it may not be as substantive as a change as it looks with regard to students' engagement in the assessment, but it does remove a barrier that some students face in terms of trying to figure out how to navigate, how to meet this requirement.
Right, and another question, OSPI is working on updates to the social studies standards. Will those standards address this proposed civics and contemporary world problems course? Who will be proposing the frameworks for that new course?
Well, I'm actually really excited that OSPI just hired a new social studies program supervisor. So really excited that they have filled that position. And we're looking forward to working with them around the learning standards. So we don't have a definitive answer for you yet, but I'm sure that the two agencies will coordinate around that piece.
All right, and for kind of any other questions that we're answering, I just want to put this out there that a question is being asked about if input is still being accepted on these proposals as we continue moving forward on writing them. But kind of with that thought in mind, another question is that many schools have been working on balancing the thought process of four-year college being the only pathway to success. Was there consideration on how we continue to navigate this conversation with students and families, since this is putting in those PPRs, that default pathway that's aligned to the CATRs?
I would say the first part, input, yes, we're still taking this. We'll be reflecting this input we're getting now on these questions. The board has a couple of more actions before their work is done, and some of this will require legislation, which has an additional process. So the board will be approving a framework at their August meeting, and then we'll have agency request legislation and rulemaking starting after our September meeting, approved at the September meeting, and then that creates a public process associated with that as well. So this is still in process, I would say, for that. And I have lost the second half of the question, Ariel.
Just around, is there any consideration or perhaps guidance given for how schools can continue to navigate the conversation of there being paths outside of a four-year college path, since the PPRs are more closely aligned to the CATRs now?
The default path is intended to not just align with colleges, but to ensure that it is aligned with colleges. Because right now, the intent, actually, the current framework was to align with college admissions, but they missed the mark. They didn't actually get all the courses necessary. So we're trying to fix that problem at the same time of keeping all the other doors open and really preparing students with a well-rounded education for any option after high school. And then the flexibility with moving some things out of core and into PPR is intended to create that opportunity for students to specialize in whatever area. So if you want to specialize and prepare for the trades, that's an option in here. If you want to specialize in a way that maybe prepares you better for a selected university, that's an option for you. And there's a lot of other options within that as well.
Another question about why not create a waiver for CTE similar to PE rather than removing the requirement completely?
Yeah, I would speak to that because this is, I think, just something we're really trying to reinforce with our reframing on the PPRs, because the idea here is that it's not just open student choice, but it has to be connected to a goal after high school when you're replacing the PPR courses. So I wouldn't really use the waiver terminology because it's more of a proactive planning rather than a ask for variance. But the idea here is that if a student wants to demonstrate that to meet my goals, I need a set of courses for which CTE is going to be a conflict. That's really when we would say a student can substitute that CTE course with, say, another language course, or another art course, another music course, another math course. So, students that want to do 4 years of 3 things kind of run into a really challenging scheduling problem when they get to that point of the high school plan.
All right, and regarding the non-credit requirements, does that mean that a student taking CTE in middle school could be marked as meeting the CTE PPR requirement and not have to take a CTE course in high school?
Potentially, but that's already the case if the CTE course is taught at the high school level. If a middle school course is taught at the high school level rigor-wise, then that can already be transcribed on a student's transcript.
Right. And with counselors spending more time working with students on the high school and beyond plan and adjusting PPR credits, do you anticipate the ratio of counselor to students being changed? And adding on to this, would the student counselor ratios be mandated rather than just a recommendation to districts?
We haven't really talked about changing the ratio, but what I would say is that it is part of the thinking behind the need for a course where students have time during the day to create some dedicated time with students to do that planning. So this is a way to add to that one.
No, other than I might just encourage folks to consider submitting public comment around from your own local perspective, how you feel about that. I just think that might be helpful for the board to see.
All right, and can you talk a little about the incentives for schools or districts to fund various robust CTE programs, PE courses, art courses, when these are not all required as core classes?
Well, I would start by reiterating that with this proposal, we also want to require that all schools offer all of the courses within the personalized pathway requirements. So schools would still need to offer those courses. I think CTE is easier in some ways because there's a funding incentive for CTE to for schools to offer CTE courses. One of the things we've also thought about, not as directly related to graduation requirements, but somewhat, is thinking about, do we want to have in law already, maybe I will say there is a requirement for districts, unless they are really small, to have to offer at least one CTE course equivalency. We've thought about, do we want to require districts to offer at least one full CTE course sequence within a program area, or finding other ways to incentivize schools to offer CTE. So if folks have ideas about that, of course, we'd also be interested in hearing them.
And kind of along those lines, if districts rely on advisories to counsel students through this process, is there going to be curriculum or training provided from the state to district staff to provide an equitable process to this information?
Yeah, so one of the recommendations for the financial aid, life skills, and high school beyond plan course would be that it be accompanied with a development of a model curriculum that districts could implement. So we didn't want to mandate a curriculum from the state level, but we did want to provide resources, and then also provide opportunities where many districts are already doing this in one way or another, and we didn't want to necessarily have to ask them to change an effective practice. But we also wanted to ensure that, yes, the resources are there for districts to be able to implement this.
Will there be examples of PPRs linked to high school and beyond plans for students that don't match the default pathway? So ways for students to see various pathways they might want to go into if they're interested in trades, various CTE program areas.
Yeah, we looked at building those in at the state level. We weren't necessarily going to dictate a set of pathways, but actually that'd be a really fantastic thing at the local level, because that's where they really know what's available for a given district or school. And so I think that could be a really awesome resource at the local level for folks to design.
I think from the state level, though, we might want to, once this proposal moves forward, offer from a communication standpoint some various examples, if that was your question. Yes.
All right, and will districts be required to offer the world language exams so students can earn the seal of biliteracy?
If you're asking my personal opinion, I think districts should be required to offer the world language exams, but we have not talked about requiring districts to do that, since we're trying to be sensitive to the enormous sort of funding challenges a lot of districts are facing right now. So I think we've had sort of a variety of ideas around that. And if the person who submitted that question has additional thoughts, please feel free to submit public comment to us about that.
I would just add to, districts are required to offer the seal currently, but they're not necessarily required to pay for an exam.
All right, another comment and question. It seems like a lot of the changes are rooted in the idea that students need more control over the courses they take and more intentional course planning. How would this proposal address the staffing problems at the school level that result in students not receiving the support they need for more intentional planning? Also, how do students gain exposure to courses, subjects, and careers they might not know they are interested in if we reduce high school graduation requirements in this way?
So I think what we have to look at as we look at from a policy standpoint is what's the additional staffing requirements based on a change in the policy. So if this proposal won't fix current staffing challenges, but new requirements that carry with them additional staffing pieces, as Alyssa mentioned earlier, would need to be funded. So that's it's a complex question on that part of it. And again, I lost the second half of the question again, sorry.
How do students gain exposure to courses and subjects and careers they might not otherwise know they're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that should come through if they're really meaningfully engaging with the high school and beyond plan in middle school and early high school. A part of that is that career interest piece to help them navigate and explore things they might be interested in. And I would anticipate that still students are going to be exposed to courses outside of the current interest and knowledge with the mix of core and PPRs. So I think there's still opportunities for that, but it does also allow more flexibility. So some students that know what they want to do can focus in and concentrate on specific areas.
Right. How were private sector businesses engaged in this conversation?
We did have several business representatives on the task force, so that's the way they were most directly engaged with. That's probably our easiest answer.
And the state standards for social studies clearly suggest world history as a focus, but world history is not a required class. Can you please address this?
Contemporary world problems would still, that content from the learning standards would still be embedded within the civics course. It's just that it would be taught from a civics lens. So still we'll certainly want to have that focus from our state learning standards.
Right, and then we have kind of a clarifying question on the 2-4-1 credit logic. If there's enough time to address the standards in one course over a year, it seems like it would be possible to address the standards of 1.5 a year.
I think that may be true, but I think sometimes it's, if you're talking about it from an interdisciplinary lens, I think sometimes the more powerful learning happens when students are able to have a more real world learning experience, since often in the world, it's not just science or just math or just English. Being able to do that through an interdisciplinary course, I think, when done well, can be a more powerful learning experience for students.
I would add to, in some cases, these courses are taking additional time. And so one of the examples that didn't show up on our slides is some of the Core Plus curriculum is 500 hours, which is roughly over 500 hours, which is really roughly equivalent to about a 3-credit course in terms of the total number of hours. But in many cases, they may only earn 1 or 2 credits for that experience, depending on how it's structured.
All right, and do you anticipate the overall amount of Carl Perkins funding being minimized with CTE not being a core requirement?
We didn't get into Perkins per se, but as Alyssa talked about earlier, there is a funding incentive. There's to offer CTE, and we know students like CTE, so we would anticipate they're still going to be taking those courses, even if it's not a core requirement. And again, there is a little nuance to the PPRs where we expect most students to still be taking these, and we've created more space for concentrators to take additional courses as well for those students who really want to double down and concentrate in these areas to get prepared for a specific field or trade.
All right, before moving into a few other questions, I just want to acknowledge that we did pin a comment up at the top for where you can submit public comment. So that can be to our website at sbe@k12.wa.us or via our Future Ready public comment form that's linked in a pinned comment. Is School Links the main way you suggest schools track this data of student plans?
Yes, particularly once every district has been onboarded to School Links by the end of next school year, once these changes take effect, which would be at the earliest after the 2027 legislative session for the graduating class of 2031.
All right, and offering competency-based credit requires extensive review by teaching staff and can be resource intensive. Will funding for this need be requested alongside the legislative proposal that requires competency credit?
We did not anticipate having that funding request associated with competency credit. And so we've yet to design what that minimum policy would look like. Looking at it, but there are certain things that don't necessarily require the competency-based crediting is often assessment-based for passing additional courses and those sorts of things. The idea of reviewing, portfolio of work is probably not something that would be in the minimum policy. Melissa, would you amend that or add to that in any way?
No, I think that's a good summary. And again, like our contact information is in these slides and you're welcome to reach out. I've spent a lot of time working with districts around their competency-based crediting policies, but always interested to hear about others' experiences and kind of what specifically you were envisioning with that question.
Right, and have a question about the geographic areas represented by the community liaisons. So we had a few kind of in this I-5 corridor area. So East African Community Services, which is based in South Seattle, the Black Education Strategy Roundtable, which is kind of in this King County in adjacent area region. And for PAVE, which is around the state, but the particular community liaison who was on the task force is in the Tacoma area. We also had the United Way of the Blue Mountains, and they are based over in Walla Walla. And for the Foundation for Academic Endeavors, that's up in the Skagit area, more northwest. And then the zone, which is over in the Spokane area. And then let's see. We have a comment about a question of the evidence-based research and information along the way that informed this proposal. So arts offers SEL and critical thinking daily. Health does not offer SEL, but instead talks about mental health. Can you please post the evidence-based research for the thought process with this proposal?
I'm just trying to figure out a succinct way to respond to that question. I think for now, I might just say that our Future Ready Google Drive that we've used with our task force is available to the public. So you are welcome to dig into that and look at the variety of resources that have been shared with the task force over the last 18 months.
I think I would add, because there's kind of two lanes on it. So we did a lot of foundational work with the board around data, but then in addition to that, over the last month and a half, we received a lot of public comment providing information about different subject areas and the benefits of those. That much of that included citations to data that both the board and the task force looked at.
And then this one is perhaps a bit specific, but maybe we can talk broadly about this considering our educator development subcommittee. But currently the personal finance class requires a CTE certification to teach the course. Are you recommending the same requirement for the new financial literacy life skills course?
I'm sorry, Ariel, can you reread that question?
Yeah, so currently the personal finance class requires a CTE certification to teach the course. Are you recommending the same requirement for the new financial literacy life skills high school beyond plan course?
Okay, thank you. That will be a recommendation that comes out of the educator development and student learning experience group, and they have not finalized their recommendations yet. So that'll be part of our report to the legislature later this year. So ongoing work in that area.
And are you expecting any new waiver mechanisms to be included in this proposal? And if so, for which requirements?
I would say the shift from core to PPR is to avoid a complex set of waivers. But the one that we are looking at is that we do think we need to sort of standardize the 2-credit waiver that I mentioned at the top of the meeting around, so some students can have 2 elective credits waived or flexible credits waived, and so we're looking at how standardizing what the policy looks like that, or setting a minimum policy among a couple of other things that feel like they would benefit from state level guidance or policy.
All right, let's see. Sorry, some of these are long, so I'm trying to find the various upvoted ones. Looks like we have a question about seeing the state superintendent's new proposal of combining the financial literacy and post-secondary education with civics. I don't see that represented. Can you talk more about this option or how it's addressed in the proposal?
Yeah, I'll start on that. So we reviewed that with the board, and we believe that sort of the spirit of that is addressed, but it's done in a little bit different way in this. And so the concept of the launch with the greater emphasis in civics that you see in the framework, combined with that financial ed, life skills, and high school beyond plan course, I think meet the same goals, but it's just implemented a little bit differently than the proposal that you shared.
All right. So there are more questions in this that we have not been able to address yet. I do just want to acknowledge that we are working on an FAQ and taking into consideration all of these questions that you've been posing. And so we'll be updating our website with answers to many of these questions soon. But we are coming up on our time. It is 12:30. Randy or Alyssa, anything you want to share?
If we could put that last slide up with our contact info, and then you should have seen in chat sbe@k12.us, which is where you can send your public comments. And so look forward to hearing more from you. Really, I want to express appreciation for everybody joining us and engaging in this conversation with us. These questions help us really formulate a more effective proposal, and just so much appreciate you taking time out of your day to continue to just share with us your thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to echo Randy's appreciation. All of these questions really do help us craft a more thoughtful proposal, just as he said. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to engage with the board. Feel free to submit public comment. As Ariel said, we'll get more information and FAQs up on our website soon. So thank you very much, and everyone have a great day.